City Planning Commission, will now come to order. It is Wednesday, March 19th, 2025 at 5:04 p.m. Mr. Barkley, we're going to start with item 1.
Yes, this was scheduled for a public hearing for a rezoning case number 111-2025. Just for the record, it was to rezone from B2 General Business to R3 Multifamily District. The following parcels: parcel 1A, 13.33 acres on the west side, Route 13, map 84, grid 20, parcel 235, tax account 01003690. Owned by Cypress Knee LLC, and lot 1, 5.18 acres, Market Street Extended, map 84, grid 19, parcel 384, tax account 01-042661, owned by Southern Ag LLC, filed by Carlton Mason Reynolds. I've had several conversations with Mr. Mason over the past week or so, and he has asked that it be tabled as far as the public hearing tonight. He would like additional time to prepare. So he has asked that it be rescheduled to the April, if I remember right, 16th meeting.
Make a motion that we table item number 1 until the April meeting at the request of the applicant.
For April 16th. I second the motion. All in favor? Item number 2, the zoning text amendment, urban design neighborhood compatibility ordinance, minimum floor requirements, overlay zoning map.
We've had this as a discussion topic on a couple of agendas, and I've not prepared a draft neighborhood compatibility ordinance. However, I have been told that the new state law, which I thought was effective last year regarding House Bill 538, if I remember the citation correctly, I thought it was in effect already, but I was told that it became effective in January, possibly January 25th. And we have gotten 2 or 3 calls on parties wanting to put or install manufactured homes, modular homes on lots within the city. And it could be as a result of this new effective date or not. So I think there's a sense of urgency, and at least in my mind, staff's mind, about coming up with a compatibility ordinance. And I do hope to have that draft presented possibly at a work session for the Planning Commission at their regularly scheduled meeting, because I do think it's a little more urgent now. That would ensure compatibility with our potential historic qualities in our area and other appropriate areas of the city. So beyond that, we also had some interest in looking at lowering our minimum floor area requirements, which is 950 square feet for a single family dwelling. So there is some interest in looking at that. That would allow more smaller, affordable type housing in the city. So that's something I think bears looking at as well. Along with that, we've talked off and on about accessory dwelling units as being something to pursue as well. I don't have any draft language on that. That also could be rolled into another element of the zoning code. So what I did produce is a copy of our planned redevelopment district floating zone section of the zoning code. I don't know why I'm getting an echo here. This is, to my knowledge, never been used before in the city, but it would have certain potential applications to allow a great deal of flexibility in meeting lot area, lot width, frontage requirements, and so forth. It contains a great deal of flexibility in it, and would suggest that, for example, in the R3 multifamily zoning district, the typical density standard is 14 dwelling units per acre. This code conceivably allows greater flexibility and greater densities. And it would permit potentially more affordable housing, including single family residential, multifamily residential, and the like. Okay, is that better? Okay. So I looked at the code again, the section of the code again, and I don't see where it needs a lot of changes to, I think, accomplish what the city would like to pursue. My understanding is the city would potentially like to consider moving forward with a new zoning designation on the 74-acre tract off Old Virginia Road, and this potentially could be an applicable zoning district for that site, which would encourage flexibility in development, flexibility in design, and a streamlined process. So I've been asked to bring this topic up to the Planning Commission for consideration, and perhaps consider initiating a zoning text amendment, a zoning map amendment, and maybe a zoning text amendment, possibly with some minor tweaks of this ordinance as appropriate, possibly for the next meeting, and to see if it's appropriate to rezone that 74-acre tract that the city owns for a flexible type zoning district. So I'm bringing that to your attention. I would encourage you to look at this section to see what you think of it. If you see any roadblocks, areas where it needs to be touched up, modified. I caught a few things when I looked at it earlier today, but nothing major. It's very flexible in terms of allowing a great deal of design options. So that's all I have on that.
So I guess, the first item, when do you expect to have, a zoning text amendment for the neighborhood compatibility? I know we reviewed the, Cambridge material last month, and it was pretty.
I want to have that prepared for your next meeting to look at as a draft. Yeah.
That didn't include a, reduction in floor area. I'm assuming that would go separately, like in an individual, like the R2 or.
Yeah, that's a separate reference in the general section of the code, that would have to be modified. If you want to eliminate that provision or modify that provision, say down to 750, or make it open to application, such as a conditional use type situation. So it does have a separate section of the code that would have to be changed.
Within that code on the 950 square feet, and when they say, you know, that obviously you can put more people in there, does the code specify the number of people?
No, that's governed, some codes do, but our code does not. It's silent on the maximum number of occupants in a dwelling unit, but it is regulated to an extent by our IRC, IBC building codes, which allow one adult basically per 100 square feet of bedroom space. If you have 150 square feet, you would allow 2 adults, which is pretty standard. So if you have a 3-bedroom, typical limit would be 6 adults living in, you know, one dwelling. Many codes that go beyond that and say you have to have no more than 6 or 5 unrelated individuals allowed to be living in a dwelling unit. And that's typical in college towns where they try and regulate the number of students, for example, in a house. We don't have that language though. So that's something to consider, but right now.
The sky's the limit to really, you know, type adults to children, you know, certain age, then, you know, you've got a son and a daughter who get to a certain age, then they have to have their own, you know, rooms. It's the sky's the limit sometimes.
Yeah.
That's why I was wondering within that new code if they would spell it out a little bit better.
In the limited research, yeah, in the limited research I've done on that topic, I understand Salisbury does have guidelines on that, possibly because it's a college town to a certain degree. But yeah, you know, when you get into defining familial status, you know, what is a family? What is an extended family? Uncles, aunts, daughter-in-law, son-in-law, cousins, you know, you can go on and on. But yeah, some communities do set standards on the number of maximum number of unrelated individuals that could be allowed in a dwelling unit. Other than that, it's regulated by your code requirements for bedroom size, number of bedrooms.
So how for the, well, I guess I had 2 things to go. The ADUs, is that part of the House bill? Because I seem to remember some state you know, at least like news releases talking about ADUs and trying to push those out? Or is that just, you know, would that be something we'd be doing proactively?
It would have to be, I think, a separate section of the code. The state did create an accessory dwelling unit task force, and they have a great deal of information online through the Maryland Department of Planning website on that topic. My knowledge, they never came up with any mandates that required cities to move forward with adoption of certain language. They have a lot of, I think, recommendations and policy guidelines on that subject the last time I looked, but to my knowledge, it was never part of House Bill 538. And there's no mandates that I'm aware of.
Yeah, they had that one seminar on it, and it was more of a discussion at the end of the day than coming up with some clear path.
Mhm.
I think Worcester County did adopt an ADU code. That might be something to pattern off of.
I thought that they were waiting for what, to see what the state was going to do when they finalized it, but at any rate, I know it's on the table.
Yeah.
Has been on the table. for a while.
Worcester County does have some standards on accessory dwelling units, possibly tied to seasonal housing. I did get a table from the planning director of Worcester County to look at. I'm not sure how it's totally applied to that situation or other areas of their county, but it is something that, you know, people have asked about. Related to that topic is the question of allowing a second dwelling unit as an accessory dwelling unit in a single family home or on the property itself. That's come up on 4 or 5 occasions over the past 4 or 5 years. So as opposed to a long-term vacant, abandoned 2 or 3 unit dwelling that now can only be converted back to a single family dwelling, the question is, could there be flexibility built into the code to allow an accessory dwelling unit in that single family dwelling, thus creating a 2-family dwelling in a sense? But it would not be zoned multifamily. It would still have some potential process to go through, such as a board of zoning a review, conditional use type situation. Could be restricted to only owner-occupied units that would be allowed to have an accessory dwelling unit. And then you get into other issues such as, what about additional impact fees? What about parking? What about compatibility? So there's a lot of issues to consider with that, but staff is open to suggestions as far as looking at a model ordinance. So I would encourage the planning commission members, if you do come across something you think looks applicable to our situation, let's take a look at it.
I remember reading language, and I thought it was the county, but I could have been wrong, but it was restrictive in the size. And I believe it possibly went to owner occupied, and it was intended to allow like an owner to have either, you know, I don't want to say Airbnb, but, you know, an unrelated person, but also like an elderly family member or a disabled family member to have their own living space that, you know, is separate from the dwelling itself. It may be in the same structure, but a separate, complete, you know, an ADU as defined.
It's something similar to the Montgomery County, we're trying to, along those lines. I was thinking with the comprehensive plan and the aging community that, you know, Pocomoke is having, that it's something I probably think down the road needs to be looked at because of the aging population that may be able to have some sort of accessory unit.
The baby boomers are there. The baby boomers are there. It's time for us to start eventually looking at what accessory housing options are we going to have for our aging senior population, and so forth. But yeah, you know, it could be something we could time with the adoption of the comprehensive plan and ask that the comprehensive plan address that and encourage that or not. So that
Something that we never really addressed, and it's really becoming front of the line as far as I'm concerned, maybe because I'm getting older and I think about it, but, you know, it seems like more people you talk to nowadays is that they're, you know, a caregiver for, you know, a family member somewhere along the line, that they're talking about it, thinking about it, it's, you know, it's on the table. It just seems to me.
Yeah, there's probably more communities that have accessory dwelling unit policies than not at this
Well,
point.
I think as time goes on and all of these different assisted living, 55 plus communities, everything is so expensive
Mhm.
that, it just makes no sense, It'd be a lot easier by building something, in the backyard
Mhm.
that, with just enough room, one of these little tiny little things that's, just, some people, I remember with my own parent, it was just like, all she needed was a little kitchenette and a, TV and a corner and a bed, they just don't need a whole lot of space.
Mhm. One
But
bedroom.
I think it's gonna have to
Mhm.
be addressed at some point.
Mhm.
I think, like, one thing I'd be concerned about is it being used as a loophole for the multifamily problem as opposed to.
That's where it could get tricky, there's no question about that, but it would have to be very, precise.
Yeah. Do you require or allow it to be an equal size to the existing dwelling unit as far as
Yeah,
square
just
footage?
cover
Or
every-
should it be a secondary use to the dwelling itself? Can it be allowed in the basement, in the garage, on the upper floor, so forth?
Is there any barrier to, so this planned redevelopment district exists in the code? Is there any barrier for the council to, would that have to come through us first, or could the council just apply that to that 75 acre property? Because actually, we talked about just the other day and realizing that it is listed as industrial, which doesn't seem to make, that property doesn't seem to make sense as an industrial property where it is. And I'm sure there's some history to that, why it was, but is there any barrier to fixing that essentially? Because I can't imagine that having industrial out there, if it's, really makes sense even in the comprehensive plan. We have an industrial park where we concentrate our industrial buildings. But.
Well, we do have limited industrial space out off Broad Street. There's very few industrial properties within the city other than this property, the 4 Broad Street properties, some unannexed properties along Broad Street, but you've got what I call the scrimmager tract, which is right next to the 74 acre tract that's been zoned also industrial or B2 for years with no interest. And part of it is that we don't have water down to that tract and or readily available sewer service to that tract as well. But you're right, there's been very little development interest in that as a industrial or business property. So
I do think to make it marketable, it probably needs to be looked at,
mhm. So I did have discussions today with the city manager about a process to move forward, potentially with rezoning. A rezoning initiative can be done by the property owner itself, by the city council, or by the planning commission to initiate a zoning map amendment or text amendment for that matter. So I'll have further discussions with the mayor and the city manager to see if they want us, the planning commission, to move forward with it. We can have something moving next month,
yeah.
possibly as a draft and then a public hearing after that. Yeah.
One party or the other needs to get the ball rolling, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we're gonna move on to old business. Item number 1 for that is Broadbridge Villas Town Home Development Project.
So in your pile of paper I put next to your place is a draft letter to Mr. Davis following up with our meeting in January. Basically acknowledges that they approved the building plans that he submitted for at least a 6-unit townhouse project. It was to be at one specific location to be determined with a record plat. We also mentioned that they're still obligated to try and coordinate that with the Planning Commission's endorsement letter dating back to January of last year, or February 14th of 2024, as well as coordinating it with the site development plan. I have prepared a draft developers agreement that would specify and detail all the obligations of the developer. I've circulated that to staff. I'm waiting on final review of that. But this would spell out in more detail what his obligations are, whether he has to bond those improvements, timing, coordination with inspection services, and the follow-up as far as when he would be able to obtain building permits. So This is a separate developers agreement. Typically, it may not need to go to the planning commission. It's more a legally binding document between the city and the developer. I'd be happy to share that with you, but I'm still waiting for its final draft on that. Well, I had a conversation with an interested party today. He's been asked to obtain a phase one environmental review of the property. So it's kind of in his hands at this point to get financing and purchase the property. So that's where it's at right now, in addition to this developer's agreement that we may be asking him to sign. So I think it's still in the matter of negotiation and finalizing the transaction for purchase with Mr. Davis.
So we're not holding him up. I mean, this commission is not holding up this development.
No, the developer's agreement is not going to hold him up to my knowledge.
So what you're saying is he hasn't gone to settlement.
Correct. Based on a conversation I had today.
There is one typo in the letter. Just on it there. Approved should be approved.
Yes, when he endorsement by the planning commission, no, the signature to send it out. There's no objections. I would ask the chair to sign it. Send it out.
No, people are interested. I've had people ask me, it's like, hey, when are they gonna build those townhouses? We're looking for, people wanna buy them, so hope we can continue to help that process along to be a good thing.
It's in his hands right at the moment.
Moving on to number 2, the comprehensive plan update, assessment update. This is from Peter Johnson and so forth.
Yeah, I gave you 5 handouts. One on the land use element, which includes a briefing, and then another draft section of the comprehensive plan on that topic, as well as a housing briefing and a housing draft section, and as well as a community facilities draft section. That was circulated earlier this month, late last month. These came in, I think, within the last week or two. So you're being asked to review these sections, comment on them. I would recommend sending the comments back to me, and we can coordinate, merge comments together, send them back to the consultant. On the community facilities element, I don't believe I handed that out, or did I? Anyhow, there's a lot of detail needed as far as questions to answer about our water and sewer capacity, that I've circulated that to our public works department and city engineer. We need to get a lot of data as far as where we're at with some of the numbers, and get that into the comprehensive plan element. So that's going to take some effort by city staff to fill in. But what I've suggested before the meeting started is that we consider a work session possibly in April, and even continuing after that, to get through all these reviews of these sections. Could take up a lot of time during a regular meeting. So I've suggested holding a work session then at some point during the month. And if the planning commission members have any ideas what day would be better, such as the second Wednesday or fourth Wednesday, I'm flexible.
I don't know if you call them Wednesdays. Is the chamber available all Wednesdays? Yes.
Except Board of Zoning Appeals. When they
And
have
Board of Zoning Appeals meets on the first Wednesday, and that meeting is still on for next month as well.
So we have the second and fourth
Correct.
Wednesday.
We've done I'm wanting in use of this room either of the next 3 Wednesdays.
I might suggest the fourth Wednesday.
Hmm.
I might suggest the fourth Wednesday.
That's fine with me. So, I mean, yeah, that's probably better just to do it right after, like the following week after our meeting. So that's fair. See if we come up with anything in that meeting and we need to go over in the work session. That sounds like a plan. So we will plan on having a work session on the 4th You're good with
Really
this?
quiet.
Good,
You're
good.
good with
Yeah.
this? I know I'm sitting here deciding.
Yeah, yeah.
Sorry, guys.
Yes, yes. The woman's world,
We reserve the day and then we let you know.
yes.
What day is that?
So the fourth Wednesday, in April.
Third.
April 30th.
That's the fifth Wednesday.
April 30th?
23rd.
Okay, at 5 p.m. Is that good with everyone?
Yes.
Sure.
Yeah.
5 p.m.
Mhm.
So these handouts, I believe before the meeting, we were talking, they're gonna be posted on the website. Are we encouraging the public to read these and provide comment to you?
Yeah, they've been put on the city's website. We're asking people to comment, send those comments back to our department, coordinate it.
Is there, when we have the work session, is there any reason to have anybody else here, anybody from Public Works that can throw in any kind of, ideas, thoughts, answer any data questions or anything like that?
They can be invited and hopefully we would, yeah, hopefully we'd have the information before the meeting. They will be invited and encouraged to come, but hopefully we would have their information incorporated already into the document for your review. Hopefully.
If you know how conversations go and then a question comes up and then we go, oh, shucks, we should have. Not that I would want to keep them the whole time because
If you have questions ahead of time, hopefully we'll get the material out to you ahead of time, that if you have questions, we can make arrangements to either get those answers or have them attend the meeting.
One question that I know I'm going to have, looking at land use and as the city expands within its borders or even beyond its borders. You mentioned, especially with those lots down on the south end of town, the availability of infrastructure. Obviously, there's going to be probably a significant expense associated with extending infrastructure to an area where there isn't anything existing. Is that maybe, could we get an idea of, as we're planning expansion of the town through the comprehensive plan with the land use, get an idea that needs to be done smartly, right? Like the city can't just go drop a couple $100K, on one area unless we expect to have some return, right? So I'd like to understand that better because I know that comes up, the infrastructure and the capacity of the city's infrastructure as it pertains to economic development in particular. Yeah,
that's a very interesting point in that I was talking to the developer today of Jenkins Orchard. And that was a scenario that occurred with Jenkins Orchard, that the Mason brothers developed that property, but the city extended the sewer line down Stockton Road, past the ballpark, and to the front edge of that subdivision in order for that development to occur. And they did so in anticipation of the property tax and impact fee revenue that would come from that development. So there's an example of the city making the effort to extend the utility out to that development at their expense. And I was told it cost at that time approximately $150,000. But that was an example of the city working with the developer, paying for part of the cost of the extension, and then getting the benefit of the tax revenue over the subsequent years. I did not know that the city had done that at their expense, but that's what I was told.
I'd like to know more about, I guess, that wasn't done on a whim, right? Like there was an intent to develop that property that was probably far along at that point, I'm assuming. And of course it was developed. I mean, Jenkins Orchard is a very successful development for the city. There has to be some kind of balance to the risk of the city making that investment when we're considering the comprehensive plan and how, because the city has very limited resources, right?
Yeah, and there's various statewide authorized mechanisms to accomplish those funding scenarios, such as what they call TIF, or tax increment financing, where the city issues the bond for the cost of the developer, pays for it themselves, and then the developer then dedicates that property tax revenue or impact fees to pay off that bond or pay back the city over time. not an unusual mechanism that's used quite frequently in a lot of other areas of the nation and state. So there's ways to do it. But without water and sewer services to that 74-acre tract, it's likely not to be developed. It just has to have water, and the capacity of the sewer line and Ocean Highway, which is operated as a force main, has limited capacity. So whether it could serve the full 74-acre tract as for sewer services is a question that still needs to be researched. And there was a study done, I think, 2 or 3 years ago on the capacity of that force main. And we do have some answers, but that would have to be explored if that were to try and serve a 74-acre development with potentially 100 homes or
You
something.
know, it's interesting, but it's gonna have, that's another thing that's obviously gonna have to be addressed. You know, going forward.
Mhm.
Otherwise, it's just gonna be, everything's just gonna stay stagnant.
Mhm.
We're not gonna get past that certain perimeter.
I did want to mention one other item that has to be on your radar screen for a future work session, and that is the critical area ordinance. Way back in the early 80s, when they first adopted the critical area program, and the critical area program basically manages development within 1,000 feet of a river or any water body within the state, such as its tributaries as well. The Critical Area Commission was established by state law and has been in operation since that time. Back in the early 80s, when they were adopting the Critical Area Program, certain communities were allowed to be opted out or have certain areas of their densely developed city excluded from the Critical Area Program. Cambridge was one of them, and Pocomoke City was one of them, and there were certainly others. So the majority of Pocomoke City is excluded from the critical area program, but there are areas such as around winter quarters, Newtown, industrial, commercial roads got affected by it. But beyond that, there's really not a lot of impact on the critical area ordinance or the program. But the ordinance itself is 69 pages long. It is a cumbersome, somewhat complicated ordinance to manage. Many communities have full-time critical area staff planners to deal with it. Because if you develop within 100 feet, you got to mitigate, replant, revegetate. There's limits on density. They have 3 categories: an intensely developed area, a limited developed area, and a resource conservation area that all come into play. And you're allowed a certain amount of acreage to develop more intensely or limited development areas that you're given, or the county can grant you another allocation. But it's a very complicated program, but we are being asked to adopt that ordinance. I did an initial review with state planners this past week. It seems to be close to final form. This is going to be put forward to you to consider for adoption at some point. So that could be a work session topic coming up as well.
Moving on to item number 3, but before we get to the approval of the minutes, in continuing discussion, the conversation that you and I had, some ideas, and go forward. I'm just having them. Can't remember what it was. Oh. I'll send an email when it comes back into thought. For the approval minutes of January 15th, 2025.
Make a motion that we approve the minutes as written.
A second.
All approved?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed? Unanimous. And do I have a motion to adjourn?
Well, before we adjourn, I just, I did notice we have a member of the public in the back, and we don't have an item for public comment. And I just wanted to ask if we could solicit for any comments.
On
questions, or
that point,
concerns.
I was asked to include a public comment section in the agenda, and I forgot to add that. So I think it is appropriate to, if anybody
Yes.
has any additional comments.
Thank you. That was one of the things I thought about. And the other one that I was throwing a complete blank on was, the, the conversation that you and I had, some ideas, and I don't remember what it was. I can't remember. What it was. I just wanted to make sure that we had that. So, thank you. That was one of the things I thought about. And the other one that I was throwing a complete blank on was, the conversation that you and I had, some ideas, and I don't remember what it was. I can't remember. gonna be worded on the rehab of a property, residential, that we would move that from 12 months to 6 months.
Mhm.
After 6 months, they have to sort of give some sort of, schedule, so.
Mhm. Yeah, in our city code, we have a reference to a 1 year open period where a person can keep a permit open. And then the question is, well, what happens after a year? Do they come back and just reapply, and have they made any progress or limited progress? And do they automatically get an extension of another building permit, and they end up taking a whole nother year where they're not making any progress on a property? And it's an issue somewhat. In the building code, the International Residential Code, IRC and IBC, it makes reference to a 6 month window that you have to keep the project active. And they should be consistent with each other. We're obligated actually to enforce both, which creates then an obvious conflict. But yeah, there are some concerns about people, keeping permits open, dragging out either demolitions or rehab work. And it should be looked at. Keep it consistent at least.
I guess just for purpose of clarification, neither one of those two topics were known to the body, so as far as open meetings go, they weren't on the agenda because they were not known to the body, we just decided to discuss them right now. But I'd like to make a motion that we add an item right now for public comment to, if the member of the public that's here would like to ask any questions, so, because especially as we're discussing comprehensive plan, we want to the door open.
A second, all in favor?
Aye.
Unanimous?
So would you like to make any comments, questions, or concerns?
Dr. Linda, Dan and I talked to, about that one. Dan and I have talked a few times and had a few conversations. My family, we're actually going into a 3rd and 4th generation ownership of my home now. Just want to make you aware, I live in a development area that was, my house was actually one of the first on the block. I'm familiar with the development out towards White Oaks and what occurred there, and just would hope, I understand there's an agreement being drafted with potentially any future developers, but that's going to be important because history-wise, our development, I believe if I'm correct, was started by Martin Groff and was assumed by the city. So just to make you aware, there's been some past boo-boos, errors, so just keep that in mind. I do have more to say, but I think at this time, that's appropriate. Thank you.
Thank you.
I say, I recently moved into White Oaks and I've been learning of some of the issues that are
No, Marty.
Yeah.
there.
You did.
Martin Groff and Construction Company was the
Yeah.
original construction developer. Yeah. There are a number of issues on our street. They have improved over the last year with Dan's help, I think tremendously. But I do also want to say, there's a lot of other factors. When you develop or consider a proposed development, there's buses being able to turn around, they're not.
Yeah, seen that.
There's things like, God forbid, we have an emergency with a fire. How's that hook and ladder gonna get there and
Yeah.
turn around?
We ran into that at
So-
Butler's. Was it
Yes.
Butler's?
Yes.
Southern Fields or one of them, especially with the buses.
Yeah, there was one other thing I wanted to say, was regarding the trailers and townhomes. There are ordinances in the county. I'm a little familiar with them, but you may want to check and kind of follow along their guidance, of course. So, I've spoken to Dan. He's been willing to meet and to discuss, so I appreciate that very much. But there's a lot of intricacies. My family has been here over 50 years now. I've owned that home over 30, so I've seen growing up outside of the town.
You're ready
but
to
also
go.
I'm diehard. The rest of the family has moved and I love this community, so I only want what's best, but I think there needs to be more planning of infrastructure.
Oh, absolutely.
Done. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Make a motion to close public comment.
A second.
Did you make a motion?
Did he seconded?
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Do we have a motion to adjourn? Does anybody else have any discussion?
A motion to adjourn?
I second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Unanimous.